Well, hello, everyone. Today's conversation is about is sort of the beginning of a dialogue about 22nd century landscapes, and our topic is the new commercial landscape. So we will be doing simultaneous Q&A, and we want to encourage you to go ahead and open that Q&A button on the Zoom and ask questions throughout the talk. And we have a whole group of people who can answer those questions. And you can really pretty much ask about anything having to do with commercial landscaping or having to do with landscaping and have it answered. If you are interested in having the whole workshop translated into Spanish, you can select the Spanish room and go into the Spanish room. So if you would like to have it interpreted out of English, click that interpretation button, and then what will come up is what language do you want to listen in? Click on Spanish. And that will take you to a room where you will hear the Spanish translation or interpretation rather. But the Q&A also will be interpreted into Spanish. So feel free to ask questions in English or Spanish. We want them all. I'm going to turn it over to Valley Water now to give us an introduction to their non-functional turf and to what they do. Ashley Shannon from Valley Water.
All right. Thanks, Pamela. Thanks for having me. Thank you, everyone. I know that there's a lot of you on that are not from our service area, but wanted to give everyone an introduction to who we are and what we do. And this is some information for the folks that are on that operate, live and work within Santa Clara County. A little bit about what we do and what we offer. So quick background, Valley Water, we are a water wholesaler. We were started originally as a groundwater management agency, but have grown from there. And the mission of Valley Water, we're Santa Clara Valley Water District, but we are known as Valley Water. But our mission is to provide our Silicon Valley with safe, clean water for healthy life, environment, and economy. And we do so by ensuring a clean, reliable water source, providing flood protection, and being stewards of our environment. Next slide.
I forgot I was driving.
Oh, yeah. I know, it's weird. So we are, as I mentioned, we're a water wholesaler. We cover the entire county of Santa Clara. So if you are within the county of Santa Clara, Valley Water, touches your daily life in some sort of way. So there are about 15 cities and over 2 million people who, live and work in our county that we service. We have 13 local water providers, water retailers. So as I mentioned, we're a wholesaler, but most folks will pay their water bill directly to a local water retailer. We work very closely with those retailers on all the programs that we offer and the messaging. We have a very collaborative relationship with them. And then we also have about 4,700 direct well owners, a lot of those in the southern part of our county. Next slide. So I'm just going to jump right in, kind of, a big thing that's on everyone's mind, in California and in our region specifically is the state's ban on the irrigation of non-functional turf, so AB 1572. And what this ban does is essentially prohibits irrigating turf that's not considered to be functional. Oh, sorry, one sec. All right. Sorry, lost my train of thought for a second. So this was approved in October of 2023, and essentially it declares potable use of water to be prohibited on non-functional turf. Functional turf is turf that is regularly used for recreational or community purposes, such as a sports playing field, a dog park, a community area of an HOA where people often have events or picnic or, congregate. The turf ban does apply to commercial sites, commercial sites, homeowners associations or similar entities but it does not apply to residential homes. So this is not for single family homes. This is for institutions, commercial, industrial, government facilities, government owned facilities, the gas station on the corner, etc. It also doesn't apply to things like cemeteries or golf courses that are considered functional. This permanent mandate does go into effect kind of in a phased approach, which I will get to in a second. But this essentially, was something that the Metropolitan Water District had a large part in helping to form this and write this with the state in response to their water needs and the MOU that they have regarding the Colorado River with several agencies down there. And so this is an effort to try to reduce the amount of water that we use in our state. Next slide. So this text, I know it's a little bit wordy on here, apologies, but it is from the ordinance itself. And basically it's kind of the impetus behind it. So, there is the idea that the use of potable water to irrigate non-functional turf is wasteful and incompatible with the state policy related to climate change, water conservation, and reduced reliance on the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta system. We also recognize, and I'm sure you're all seeing this in the news, climate change is bringing significant enduring changes to California's water supply. So this ordinance is a direct response to that in order to ensure that we have enough water for the people in our state. The image on the right is from the California Drought Monitor. This was taken just on the 28th of January. And so this is, if you're not familiar with the Drought Monitor, you just kind of look it up, but it's a really interesting map that kind of shows where we are in the state as far as drought. And the darker red you get, the deeper into drought, and the lighter areas are not in a drought situation. The next slide. So the AB 1572 is being phased in. It's a phased approach, and it starts in 2027. And it's starting with government facilities. So these are state and local government facilities. So, if there's non-functional turf lawns around a courthouse or, at the, just in the area around government facilities. This isn't parks, although there may be non-functional turf at a park. So you may have non-functional turf in the parking medians in the parking lot at a park. Those would be considered non-functional. The next phasing in approach is the 2028, which is institutional, commercial, and industrial sites. So, as I mentioned, the gas stations on the corner, or your local bank that has a large expanse of lawn in front of the bank that isn't used for anything recreationally. And then in 2029, we move our way into HOAs and similar entities. The state's ban on the irrigation of non-functional turf does not apply to multifamily housing. Valley Water, we actually have an ordinance of our own that is triggered. We have it all the time, but enforcement of it is triggered during a drought situation. Our ordinance does include multifamily, but it's a similar ban on the irrigation of non-functional turf. And again, we enforce during a drought situation. So if we were to see ourselves go into a drought situation before the state's ban kicks in, our ordinance would be enforceable in our county, in our service area that gets water from Valley Water directly or indirectly. Primary enforcement of this is going to be local city or urban water suppliers. And right now, a lot of the nitty-gritty about how this will be enforced, how compliance is met, exactly which areas and stuff, all that nitty-gritty is still being worked out. It will be up to the State Water Board to further define those. And so I know a lot of people have a lot of questions right now. Some parts of it are not super cut and dry, which I recognize. But right now, mostly it's about, education and kind of getting aware of it and working towards it, because we have a lot of sites, especially in our area, that have quite a bit of non-functional turf. And so it's going to take some planning to get on board. Next slide. As I mentioned, Valley Water has our own ordinance that was passed in response to during our last trial that we experienced. Our ordinance is similar in that it bans the irrigation of non-functional turf. It is in place, and again, it is enforceable during a drought situation. So if we were to see ourselves go into a drought, we would start enforcing, and we have a water waste complaint tool that the public can use if they see, irrigation or water waste or runoff, things like that, that they could report in our area. We work very closely with our water retailers and municipalities on this enforcement, and have a close relationship with them as far as whether we, go out and do the enforcement education, or our water retailers do. Next slide. We've also created, and actually I should have updated this image. We just updated our little handout, but we have a handout that kind of helps define what we consider to be non-functional turf versus functional turf. And so we can provide this as a resource, but essentially, we go through and kind of state what we believe to be functional turf. So, the sports fields, again, that are very a little more obvious, and then non-functional turf, such as parking medians, parking strips, any area that is not regularly used. Both our ordinance and the state's ordinance do make exceptions for the irrigation of and the health of trees. And so for us, we've defined that as we won't enforce the ban on the irrigation of lawn that is directly under the canopy of a tree to ensure the health of that tree. Again, the RBN applies to all non-single family sites, essentially, in our county, and this includes HOAs, commercial, industrial, condominiums, apartments, etc. All right, next slide. So here are just some examples. These are some of the easier, more obvious examples of non-functional turf. The parking strips, parking lots, anything that's kind of running up against a sidewalk are usually, the best, easiest ones to start with. And if you're not really sure about a site, these are pretty cut and dry. They are narrow, they are hard to irrigate. And in the States, for new construction, for sites that are subject to the model water efficient landscape ordinance, these strips of lawn aren't allowed anyway in new construction. Narrow strips of lawn are very hard to irrigate without significant overspray, as are lawns on slopes, etc. So these are pretty clear examples of what would be considered non-functional turf. Next slide. Here's a few more examples. These are from projects that have gone through our rebate program, which I'll mention in a little bit. But again, parking that's lawns that are adjacent to parking. It's not really an area that's safe to play. Little tiny narrow strips of lawn. If one way to look at it, if the only time that you're walking on that lawn is to push a mower, that will likely fall under the definition of non-functional turf. And so these are just some examples of projects that are considered non-functional turf, and some of which have gone through our rebate program to switch those out. Next slide. So as you prepare for AB 1572, I know that like 2029 can seem a little ways off if you're an HOA, but planning now is going to be really essential to meeting this ban as it comes up. We've worked with a lot of homeowners associations or different sites, and really, I think in the beginning, education awareness is really crucial. So it can be very hard sometimes, especially with a homeowners association, if you're working with them, to really get all the residences on board and to understand this. But the earlier we start educating sites about it, especially if you are a landscape company and you're working with these sites, the easier it will be to implement these changes. One of the best things that we can do is just go through a site and start mapping, start walking the site and saying, hey, I think that this is obviously non-functional. This area, we may be able to consider it functional. Let's think about the reasonings and map those areas out. Google Earth is a really great, easy, free tool that you can use to measure areas, get your square footage. Because if you don't know how many square feet you have to work with, it's very hard to plan and budget for that. So, really start looking critically at your sites and deciding, hey, which lawn areas are we going to have to make some changes to for compliance. For compliance right now, it doesn't state what has to happen to that lawn. So compliance could be as simple as turning the irrigation off in those areas and letting that lawn go brown. It could be mulching those lawn areas, or it could be replanting that area with non-lawn material, non-turf material, and lower water use plants. And that's the direction that we are hoping that people go to that most sustainable, and what we'll be talking about today, to make sure that we're not just killing the lawn and leaving it brown, but we're actually transforming that into something that's sustainable and will benefit our communities. The next thing to think about is budgets. And we know that these are not going to be cheap for some sites, and it will depend on what that site wants to do. There are options, again, as I mentioned. You could be as simple as turning it off, or it could be a full re-landscaping. And so, understanding your square footage, starting to look at the budget. As you look at the budget, though, thinking about return on investment is also important. And a lot of times people consider, when they're looking at return on investment, they're looking at two factors. One, the cost of that lawn conversion project, and two, the savings that they're going to get on their water bill. But there's actually a lot more things to consider when you're looking at that. So we'll often see decreased maintenance costs when you switch from a lawn to a low water use landscape, as well as the cost in water. But one thing that sites often don't think about is a decrease in other types of maintenance or property damage. So we see a lot of water damage from sprinkler runoff into parking lots. Asphalt has to be replaced. A lot of fences are getting stained. Water damage from overspray. So those are things that kind of can be considered as well. And then the last thing is just to consider a maintenance plan. If you've been working with companies or you've been doing maintenance, that's just the mowing of lawn, it is going to be a shift to maintain these new landscapes. And so in that planning and in the budgeting, it's really important to think long-term about your maintenance plan. So these are kind of some things we can do to prepare for AB 1572. Next slide. And then as you're budgeting and as you're thinking about these programs, wherever you are, look at your local agencies, see if there's any financial assistance from these agencies. So Valley Water, we have a very robust water conservation program. I'm going to go through some of the mini programs that we have, but I'm going to focus on the ones that are specifically for outdoor and for larger areas. So we have our landscape rebate program is a very popular program with a really robust budget. And so we have up to $3,000 for residential sites and up to $100,000 for commercial sites. And actually with partnerships with some of the water retailers in our county, those amounts are even higher because they add to our budget through cost sharing. So through this program, we have irrigation equipment upgrades, large landscape lawn to mulch, landscape conversion, and rainwater capture. And I have in the next slide, we'll go through a couple of those in more detail. So our landscape conversion rebate is for the removal of lawn and replacing it with a low water use landscape. We do require that a certain amount of new plant material be planted in that area. Again, we want to encourage sustainable gardens that are going to increase biodiversity, help cool the air, reduce that heat island effect, help hold soil in place and protect our creeks and our streams and stormwater runoff. And so we do have some requirements to add some plant material back in. And then other things such as low flow irrigation, mulch to protect our soil, and permeable hardscape. So this rebate is based specifically on the square footage of lawn removed and then replaced with these qualifying elements. Next slide. Our large landscape lawn to mulch rebate really was this was a little more recent in response to the state's ban and our own ordinance. We did recognize that a lot of sites may not have the funding to do a full landscape conversion where they're putting plants back in. And so we offer this lawn to mulch rebate for sites that really just kind of wanted to, get their lawn out quickly and get some mulch in place. And then maybe in the future, decide to replant that area. But this is a reduced rebate of $1 per square foot. Again, it's very minimal. There's not the plant requirement in it. Our hope is that people, participate in our landscape conversion where they're putting plants back in. But this is the next tier to kind of help those sites that may, be needing to take kind of a phased approach in their lawn removal. Next slide. Also, if you're in our area, we offer a couple programs, our large landscape survey program and our water-wise outdoor survey program, to help sites understand how they're using their irrigation water and whether they're using it efficiently. So our large landscape survey program is, we work with a company called Waterfluence, and they will come out and do full irrigation system checks at larger sites, HOAs, commercial sites. Provide site-specific recommendations, and they also provide an irrigation budget. So a lot of large sites within our county are already enrolled in this program. You can go on our website and look at a map, find your area, and if you see that it's outlined like in the orange, like on the map, the program, the site is actually enrolled, and the site is getting, we're getting water data from their water retailer. The site has a budget that was created for it, and those, we're comparing the budget to the actual water usage, and showing whether a site is over or under. So this is a really great service, and a lot of sites I think don't even realize that their site is enrolled in that. So I do encourage you to check that out. For smaller sites, we have our waterways outdoor survey program. And so again, if you're working with the site and there's significant, it looks like they could probably use a little bit of an irrigation system check. This is a great program. Again, both of these are free for sites within our county. Both of these programs can also inform customers on their eligibility for our rebate program too. So they'll be able to point out and say, hey, you're using a lot of inefficient nozzles and sprinkler bodies. There are rebates for upgrading those nozzles and sprinkler bodies. Or, hey, this whole area is likely non-functional turf. Consider the landscape conversion rebate for getting that over. So pretty great programs. All right, next slide. All right, so in conclusion, water conservation is a California way of life, and that's what our programs are aimed at. So we're not looking at just drought response, we're looking at long-term water conservation. So things like removing a lawn, replacing with a low water use plants is really a commitment to water conservation now and into the future. The non-functional turf irrigation ban is coming. Compliance will be mandatory with that. So it's really important to start planning right now. And just, the fact that you're here and listening to this workshop is a really great step in trying to kind of learn how to best do that. If you are interested in any of our programs, we do offer, with our rebate programs, the landscape rebate program, we have office hours, and they're every week. We have them on Wednesdays and Tuesdays, second and fourth of Wednesday. And they're really great. Just kind of come, ask your questions, and we're there to help. So with that, I will pass it back over to Pamela for the meat of the presentation.
Fantastic. That seemed like a meaty presentation right there. So thank you for helping us to understand that better. And I wanted just to take a moment before we dive into the puzzle pieces and remind you that this webinar is going to be presented in English and Spanish. So if you would like to have an interpretation of the webinar in real time, go ahead and click on the interpretation little world icon on your Zoom screen, and then select Spanish for the room that you want to be in. So we look forward to also recording this particular webinar, and hope that you will share it with your other friends, the professionals who missed out on having it live. I finally want to remind you that there is Q&A going on at the same time as the presentation. So click on that Q&A button, open it up, and you can see what other people are asking about, and you can even add on to other comments. You might have a suggestion or further comments, want clarification, and you can actually add on to previous questions. So it's kind of a community chat going on right there, and my colleague Marianne Simon from G3 is moderating that. Okay, here we go. The puzzle pieces of this particular webinar, we're going to talk a little bit about why we even care that this whole non-functional turf thing is going on. Then we'll talk about how the watershed approach is applicable in commercial properties. And when I use the word commercial, I'm pretty much embodying all of these types of properties that Ashley just discussed that are eligible for non-functional turf removal. Then we're going to talk about the role of biodiversity in healthy landscapes, how biodiversity actually determines what is going to happen in your landscape. Then we're going to go into a little bit of the science behind how landscapes are able to become more resilient. And this is through a process called succession. How can we harness succession to our benefit? We'll talk about naturalistic planting design, which is a definitive approach to landscaping that is a worldwide phenomenon and has just incredible results that we'd like to see everywhere in California. And then we'll talk a little bit about strategic investment in turf replacement programs. You know, where do you start? What are some key things that we should get done right away, and go from there. So why in the heck do we care about non-functional turf? Well, look, I think it's just pretty clear that monoculture lawns don't make sense. I mean, they need 4 to 6 feet of water, depending on where you live, and that per year in order to be happy and healthy. They are conventionally maintained with lots of chemicals that you don't want to be, you wear protective clothing to apply. So why would anyone else want to be in contact with that? There's very little, if any, pollinator and habitat benefits. And because of all this chemical application and so forth, it's often super compacted and therefore provides very little stormwater reduction or flood control. It's usually spray irrigated, so you have overspray. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. It's a whale. It's an ocean out there when you have a big monoculture lawn. But the alternatives that we see can be really dismal. Lots of decomposed granite, lots of rock covered areas or places with sparse plantings, even conversions that, on paper, I'm sure this particular conversion appeared reasonable. Some climate appropriate shrubs, some climate appropriate grasses, drip irrigation now, and decomposed granite. But first of all, this tree was incredibly damaged by the spray irrigation previously, and there really isn't anything here in this design that is oriented to helping that tree to recover from, if it can, from that damage previously. So, and on top of it, I think dismal is the right word for this. And it could even be dangerous landscaping, where we find that, the mostly for cost purposes and sometimes for aesthetics, that the grass is taken out and then invasive species are planted and they will get out. So that is that there are multiple invasive species going on here in this picture. And look, they're coming out of the asphalt, so they're determined to make their presence known. But we really don't want this kind of thing happening. If you look across the street, you can see what's happening there in that previously non-functional turf area. So this is what we want to avoid, and we definitely want to avoid people going in the direction of using synthetic turf or synthetic materials in order to replace their lawns. And just to be clear, I'm talking about property owners who are probably not participating in these rebates, because the cool thing about the rebates is there are standards. But this investment in landscaping, and there's going to be a lot of information coming out about the non-functional turf ban. These are reactions that the property owners have, and they just aren't informed. And to be frank, I mean, the investment in synthetic turf is pretty expensive. This could have been a really incredible natural setting as an alternative. And I wanted to share this because I just thought this was one of the most ironic things I had ever read, that, a win for California was considered when Aaron Brockovich replaced 3,000 square feet of grass with artificial turf. And I just think that's really super ironic and demonstrates the important role that landscape professionals play in education and demonstration, just change the world by doing. So one of the things that we are going to explore today is how do we actually create these accessible, affordable, and resilient landscapes? And my goal is to inspire you to find ways to overcome some of the more obvious barriers to change. And I've identified these as cultural, social, financial, regulatory, and a knowledge gap. But I'm sure there are other barriers. These are just the ones that I've come up with. And hopefully, if you have other ideas, you'll put that into the Q&A. So the challenge is, we're really good at messaging. Water agencies and stormwater agencies and cities, can get out the message about the fact that the non-functional turf irrigation is going to be banned and what that schedule is. But how do we keep from suffering the unintended consequences of desertification and disaffection if those landscapes do not meet the expectations that we are setting? And start to look like those images that we just took a look at. So what do we do? Now, culturally, there is an incredible anti-lawn movement that is taking place across the country. Marketing units have done an incredible job. I think this is one of the most haunting images I've ever seen. And of course, the platform being the New York Times, this is a national discussion. So this is definitely underway, and really lawn has become almost demonized, which has its good points in that the awareness is there that it is something that is a resource consuming type of landscape. But maybe there's a nuance to that we should be thinking about, and that'll come up in just a minute. We have these residual effects of social isolation, and this is on the rise in our country. And I don't have any statistics, but I would speculate on the rise in California. Being a tech hub and having such dense city life, I think that it's possible that these things are really concentrated in the urban areas. And the two things that I'm particularly pointing to are biophobia, which is a fear essentially of nature. And it's a complete disconnection or even anxiety when confronted with nature. Don't want to get dirty, don't want to see insects, don't want to be in places where there might be pollen or things happening outside. And then we also have agoraphobia. Agoraphobia is a anxiousness that happens when people are in unfamiliar environments or places where they have little control. And honestly, outdoor spaces are pretty difficult to control. So people with agoraphobia are avoiding these places and avoiding open spaces and so forth. And the reason that I'm putting this in as a social issue is because when people are suffering from biophobia or agoraphobia, they are actually looking at landscapes in a completely different way. The conversation with them has to be altered in order to even get their buy-in that it's something to think about. It's certainly not difficult to understand the regulatory rationale. Ashley mentioned that one of the reasons for the overall California irrigation NFT irrigation ban was driven by Southern California and their relationship with the Colorado River. Drought effects, though, affect us all in California. And so it's not difficult to understand why there would be a close look at any landscaping that isn't functional and why precious water is put on those landscapes. And again, there may be some nuance there, and we will discuss that in a bit. The other thing is that there is a knock-on effect of emission reduction when we transform landscapes away from conventional turf grass. And this is really felt through a reduction in the small off-road engines. In the summertime, 53% of emissions from small off-road engines is generated by landscaping. So this is something to really, think about, that it's not just about water. It's about all these other benefits that we could reap. And regulatory environment is understanding that. There's also a knowledge gap. And this is something, of course, that we can overcome with education. And that is not going to happen instantaneously. We've got to get going. Maintenance and installation crews have been doing this way, for a long time. And we also have a knowledge gap with consumers. And it kind of goes back to that biophobia where, and this is a different take on biophobia. This is a more generalized thing that is happening in our society. And it has been called plant blindness. The sort of official way of talking about it is plant awareness disparity, plant blindness. Essentially, even when shown a picture like the one that you see here, people cannot identify that there are plants in the picture. It's not that they can't identify the plants, it's that they do not see the plants in the picture. I mean, wow, right? So this is a cognitive bias, and it's manifest in a complete inability to notice plants in one's life. And so when people can't even see plants, how are they going to appreciate them? They completely lose a context for aesthetic value. Animals become far more important than the plants are. They don't understand how plants actually are affecting them, are affecting their mental health, affecting their physical health. And they really don't see plants as an integral part of ecosystems or resiliency living in a community. So this is something that we definitely have to be aware of, and it's more prevalent than you can imagine. So when I said, how do we make sure that we avoid unintended consequences? The most important unintended consequence, in my opinion, is desertification. Desertification has been on the rise over the last 20, 30 years. And it's probably been happening even longer than that in rural areas, but especially in urban areas, we are seeing this incredible increase in the heat island effect. And this is because what's happening on our ground cover is essentially raising the temperature of the environment. So I want us to be thinking about this because this is ultimately going to impact how we view the plant cover and what kind of living cover we want to introduce into the landscape after we remove the grass, because the grass here in this picture is doing a great job of cooling off the environment. So we want to make sure that when we remove it, we don't have an unintended consequence of increasing heat island. And this is a real issue. And especially, I mean, it's being dealt with in rural areas, but it is especially important for us in urban, suburban areas and urban communities to be thinking about how we are contributing to the violent weather patterns that we are seeing. And really, the main contributor isn't about how much atmospheric carbon there is, I'm sorry to say. It really has to do with this heat island effect. Hotter soil surfaces create a more violent weather pattern, contribute to it. There is a direct correlation and causation between urbanization, so essentially paving over or making hotter, this heat island effect, and resulting overdrafting of groundwater, the degradation of our soil, and really just turning into man-made desert. And then there's a direct correlation and causation between that making of a desert and having the conditions of extended drought and violent and unpredictable rainstorms. Sound familiar? Yeah, it's come to California for sure. And really, it's very simple physics that's at work here. When you have a surface that is hot, water evaporates from it. It's just the law of science. But when you have a surface that is cool, water condenses on it. So as landscape professionals, we really almost have a mandate to cool our cities by planting as much as we possibly can so that we can start condensing water into our communities instead of allowing it to evaporate out of our communities. And there is, this is a great image that I happened on a couple of years ago during an incredible drought that hit very, very quickly. Actually, not drought, but heat wave that hit very, very quickly in Phoenix, Arizona. Over the course of just a few days, the temperatures peaked in Phoenix. And I want you to observe this image where this is prior to the heat wave. And you can see that all of that blue, all of that green, these are areas that are condensing water. This is a, this is a kind of a baseline how things can be. And of course, the peaks of mountains and areas that, you can see the areas that are particularly urbanized are not as green. Well, just 10 days later, 15 days later, during the heat wave, how did that look? Well, the areas that were not covered by plants were evaporating water and were burning, not burning up, I'm not going to say that, but were so hot and getting hotter because they were not covered by plant material. And so this is just a really quick way to see, yeah, planting matters. And in the context of discussing weather patterns, this is a really great bit of research that you can do for yourself. It's called the New Water Paradigm at Michael Kravchuk rather, was the initiator of this some 20 years ago, and it has really come into the dialogue worldwide. And essentially, this is a focus on what's called the small water cycle. Before we had the development that we do now with the covered areas that are paved over, and we don't have the benefits of evapotranspiration from plants, and we don't have the benefits of water gathering, on the land and cooling, having a cool surface. That's what the previous condition was. But since we have development, we've actually raised the heat island effect, we've raised the temperature of all these things. And as a result, the small water cycle, which is the water cycle that governs rainfall over terrestrial areas, this small water cycle has been broken. And because it has been broken, because we now don't have water, we don't have clouds forming over terrestrial areas, and we don't have that gentle rain happening, all the energy that used to be in the small water cycle has been transformed into the large water cycle. And that means now that our storms are more violent and they're more unpredictable, and and we get the massive swings between drought and deluge. So if you're interested in this, I really recommend that you look at a New Water Paradigm. And this picture really says it all. You could not see a more stark example. This is a ranch in the Chihuahuan Desert. It's about 35,000 acres. And on the left-hand side is the managed ranch where native grasses have recovered and come back. It's really becoming much more of the grass prairie that the Chihuahuan Desert used to be, which, can you believe it? But it's true. And those cooler acres are actually condensing atmospheric water. The grass itself is generating evapotranspiration, and it's putting what are called biosols into the atmosphere. Those biosols are actually soil-based microbes, okay? We'll talk about that in a little bit, but the plants are taking these soil microbes and putting them up into the atmosphere when they evapotranspire, or when they transpire, and when they're transferring water from the soil to the atmosphere. And those biosols condense water from the clouds at a lower elevation than any other particulate. So the result is that over areas that are densely covered by this plant material, the clouds form and the gentle rain comes. But in the areas that are hotter, where we don't have the evapotranspiring plants, and that lots of area is bare and uncovered, we have the release of water from that soil. So actually, the rain isn't happening there. The water is being pulled out of that soil at an even more rapid rate, and they don't get the benefit of the condensation that would happen in the cooler areas. So this is an excellent example of the small water cycle in action. And this is something that we can replicate. It doesn't have to be a ranch. Our cities are large enough that we can actually replicate this by planting a lot more things. So another look at multiple benefits or multiple effects when we don't have a soil sponge, when we don't have healthy living soil and lots of good plant cover, we have things like this. This happened to be a day when I was going to spend the day in an orchard, an almond orchard, and this one, it had just rained, and this one was filled with water, flooding, runoff coming off the site, and the orchard that I went to had cover crops. So densely planted, no standing water. I mean, that water infiltrated, all those trees got the benefit of that water that came from the sky. So really, I mean, I think this is one of the great cases for why we need to plant and plant a lot. Okay, let's talk about how the watershed approach actually applies to commercial landscapes. The watershed approach is essentially evaluating every landscape, every property, as though it's a mini watershed. And what we are doing is we are looking for where the water falls on the property, which is often, first interception is often the roof of a building, sometimes tall trees and so forth, but it's generally the roofs of buildings. And then the low point of the watershed is the street. And really, in our context, our urban context, streets are kind of like rivers during rainstorms. So we're looking at where the water falls and where the water runs off the property, and everything in between that, the property owner can control. And we would like to propose that we utilize 4 key principles to essentially regenerate these properties and turn them into healthy, functioning mini watersheds. So we're keeping water on the property, we're building the soil, we're planting lots of plants, and we're getting all the water, all the cycles that would be happening on a healthy watershed. And those 4 principles of watershed-wise commercial and institutional landscapes are the same as they are for residential. We're going to focus on growing healthy living soil to create a sponge. Then we're going to also direct as much rainwater as possible into these sites so that we can passively capture that rainwater in the soil. Third, we select climate appropriate plants, not just local native plants, although those are the best climate appropriate plants. But we're looking to have a lot of plants. I'm going to spend a lot of time on that in a later section. And then finally, we're going to use highly efficient supplemental irrigation only when necessary. So in the context of the non-functional turf, it's hard to imagine that spray irrigation continues to be the most efficient irrigation in these very narrow areas. So it's likely a conversion to drip irrigation, or even trying to do things without supplemental irrigation. So something to think about. And then making sure that the irrigation control is state of the art, whether it's a smart controller device or a smart controller property manager, landscape manager. Excuse me. Now, we have actually expanded the key 4 principles into what we call tactics. And these are 8 very specific things to think about as you are creating a landscape, whether designing or implementing a landscape, that will bring you more toward a regenerative solution. So this is a solution that is becoming more and more resilient over time and is actually healing past conditions. So these 8 principles, or 8 tactics really, of implementing the watershed approach can be utilized in any landscape, but particularly in commercial landscapes, it makes sense. So the first thing is to consider your context. It's the right plan in the right place. Context is important. Every single property owner is going to have a different view of what their landscape could be or should be. And this is all very important information to gather, and also gathering information about resources that can be utilized for social, cultural, knowledge gap attenuation. So you're actually helping people to understand what's going on by using these resources. That's number 1. Number 2 is minimal disturbance. We're going to talk about that in a bit. Number 3 is welcome rainwater as a resource, not a destroyer. This is actually a school where it flooded all the time, and so the answer was put in a rain garden and make it an area that kids can actually see what's going on and experience when it rains. Number 4 is create a living soil sponge by covering the soil surface. So the soil surface can be covered with things that are dead or decomposing, like compost, mulch, or plant debris, or it can be covered with plants themselves. And this ground cover is actually an armor that protects the soil. It's super important that the soil not be exposed. When it gets exposed, that's when temperatures really rise. Now, I do want to mention that just having a mulch cover is a half measure, because the surface temperature of mulch can also get pretty high. But what's happening underneath it is critical, because underneath the mulch, the soil is being kept cool, which means there's microbial activity and decomposition of that organic matter that is being placed on top as armor to the soil. Number 5 is make sure you have lots and lots of plants. We call this the liquid carbon pathway. There are 2 ways to build soil. Decomposition pathway, which we just talked about, where organic matter is being decomposed, and then the liquid carbon pathway, which is plants themselves building the soil through their root exudates. And this is really the most powerful way. The fastest way to change a landscape is by densely planting. Diversity is the key to resilience. Number 6 is all about maximizing diversity in all forms. The Number 7 is animal impact. And in the context of a commercial or institutional site, or even just an urban suburban area, we're looking at animal impact as those animals that can actually be on this property, many of which are, native creatures, inviting them in to interact with the landscape and have that beneficial impact onto the landscape. And we also want to encourage human animal impact, because there is a symbiotic relationship between nature or landscapes and people. And when people are engaging with the landscape and actually in it, they are doing as much beneficial work as really any animal could. Our hair cells and skin cells are shed onto the landscape, and the landscape microbial community responds positively to that kind of stimulus. Number 8, essentially remembering, and number 8 is no random acts. And only random acts. That's funny. That's exactly the opposite. So let's repeat it just to be clear. Number 8 is only random acts. And what we are essentially saying here is that we need to keep in account that every single action we take in a landscape has either a cascading or a compounding effect. Now, cascading is not necessarily a bad thing. It just means that something is decreasing or something is diminishing. So a positive cascading effect would be a reduction in pests. That is a positive cascading effect. And sometimes compounding effects are not necessarily positive. I mean, you could have more pathogen in the landscape. That's compounding, but it's not a beneficial thing. So trying to avoid putting a value judgment on whether it's a cascading effect or a compounding effect, it's important to remember that everything you're doing in the landscape transformation is going to have one or the other. And these effects are going to continue on in maintenance and in every aspect of that landscape. Oh, by the way, not maintaining it or not interacting with it, this is an action and it's going to have an effect. So we need to understand that these are living systems, and it goes beyond just designing it and stick it in the ground. I want to spend a little time on a program that was very popular throughout California, using the watershed approach and implementing the strategies that we are talking about at commercial institutional sites. And this is primarily a turf removal response. The Surfrider Foundation actually developed something called ocean-friendly gardens. And this is an approach to reducing urban runoff, essentially, and managing stormwater in landscapes. And the multiple benefit from the ocean-friendly gardens is that we get water use reduction, we get the benefits of biodiversity and so forth. And it's a holistic way of thinking about landscapes. And it's a good start for us to begin to think about what are some positive things that we can do when we remove the grass. So here's a commercial site. It's not grass, but it is actually a non-functional area. This challenge here is that it's an enormous commercial building and a very tiny landscape area. So how does this get dealt with? Well, one of the first things that had to happen here was that stormwater capture was implemented. And since there really wasn't a lot of room to do bioswales and so forth, and the quantity of water that was coming off of the building was so massive and really directed into this area and into the adjacent parking lot. So the first thing was to install the stormwater capture features, which was essentially a few infiltration chambers in order to get that water and move it into the soil. I just want to mention, when you take a look at this picture, this is sandy soil, but a jackhammer had to be used in order to dig anything in this soil. And you have to ask yourself, now, how is that possible that sandy soil is so compacted that you have to use a jackhammer? Well, the site is irrigated with recycled water, and also the maintenance practices on that previous landscape were still using chemical inputs, and the result is that the soil was completely, dead or dormant. And so it needed to be mechanically enhanced in order to get anything accomplished. The other thing that happened at this site, which is very accessible for really any commercial site, is that the walkways were designed to hold on to stormwater, and they were ADA compliant. So this was an opportunity to get people into the landscape by making these walkways an additional part of the stormwater management. And here we have the ocean-friendly garden after. You can see the walkway, which is holding on to stormwater. The infiltration chambers are underneath, and it's a predominantly native plant landscape and highly biodiverse. Here's another institutional site, a very large building and a very small landscape. That seems to be a theme in these institutional settings. And of course, it's all lawn. And the community here wanted an ocean-friendly garden to maximize community engagement. This was actually going to be used as an education site by an adjacent library. And they also wanted edible plants and lots of California native plants for pollinators. The stormwater retention is again in the pathway. So the pathway is about 12 inches deep of mulch, and it gets replenished every year. It's easy to roll a wheelbarrow over it. And it's a very, very low cost solution where your swale basically becomes your walkway. The community led the construction of this, and the adjacent library created nature-based educational programs as a result. Here's another institutional site before. Water from this drive area gathered on this giant roof. Once again, tiny landscape area, giant roof area. Again, I do think that's a commercial thing. And all of these buildings would flood during a rainstorm. So it was imperative that this grass area be turned into some kind of giant sponge. And that's exactly what happened, but it had to happen at very low cost. So we prioritized parts of the landscape that would just be covered with mulch. So the grass was sod cut. First of all, one thing I want to mention is everything you see using the watershed approach is using a mechanical removal. So there is no application of glyphosate to remove the lawn. It's all sod cut and then hand removed or sheet mulched afterward. So this is a theme that you may see it in the notes that are accompanying these slides, but I just wanted to point out that that is a key component of this because obviously water quality is the primary concern of an ocean-friendly garden. In this particular case, for cost reasons and also because it's a very high impact area, kids are walking across this landscape a lot. We prioritized areas closer to the entrance of the building as being the planted areas, and the rest of it was going to be mulched. And if plant material came up through that, it would be evaluated as to whether or not it could remain without being removed. Here's an example of what's going on, very, very low cost, including the swale, which is right in front of you. Another school, and this one even more in a naturalistic planting approach. The students actually designed and built this, this project, or helped with the design and construction of the project. And they determined where their pathways wanted to go, and they also showed us where they thought the rainwater capture should go. And again, very low cost from a planting perspective and from a rainwater catchment perspective. It was prioritized to bring people into the courtyard for more than just a walking through it. The trees were planted to create some cover and give it interest. And in general, it began to become more of a kind of hangout spot for people, which is exactly what the school intended. Here's a City Hall application, and you can see here that It's predominantly a California native landscape. The priority was about pollinator habitat and biodiversity. There's a stormwater retention area that is occurring in a thick mulched pathway. Again, utilizing the stormwater also as walking areas or as areas that can pull people into the landscape. The project was value engineered, and this is an issue that we have with these, especially with these large projects for commercial institutional customers, is that the budget is usually, half of what is actually needed to do the project. And then over the course of implementation, it becomes even smaller because of unforeseen circumstances and deferred maintenance. And that value engineering that happens in the design and installation process, maybe, plants are chosen for price instead of for quality. Maybe the turf wasn't removed, thoroughly. There wasn't time taken in removing it for sheet mulching. Maybe only an inch of mulch was put down instead of 3 or 4 inches of mulch. And when those things happen, they have negative cascading effects on the landscape going forward. So 10, 15 years later, you come back to these landscapes and it looks like it hasn't been maintained, yet it has been maintained to the best of the ability. But the real issue was in that original design installation and the value engineering that happened at that time. So the lessons of these landscapes can be that spending the money up front really does make a huge difference as time goes on, because the landscape is trying to be as biodiverse as possible. It's trying to help you out on that mission. But if it's not given a good start, it can't do it. So here's another after image. You can see these are areas where people can actually even walk through the landscape, and it's encouraged. And another one. Here's another city hall, different city hall. I included it because here the mandate was to have lush landscaping, which is something we hear a lot about from institutional or government buildings. They want it to be lush. They want it to be inviting, flowering most of the year. And that could be out of sync with our California native and Mediterranean plant palette, which is, geared to be blooming at times, sort of counter programming to other parts of the world. And also that there was a concern here that the stormwater and retention area had to be kind of like hidden. And they wanted to make sure that this could not become an encampment site. So these are things to be considering in all of it. And certainly the dense planting of the whole landscape is one way to encourage people coming into it and, observing it or sitting near it for the cool, but not taking up residence in it. Finally, a community center. We have here more application of turf removal. You can see again, dense planting, giant swales, because again, big building, little area for landscape. And this also had value engineering issues over time. So these landscapes really need to be carefully considered. And then actually, finally, I want to talk about this county building, because this was a very interesting ocean-friendly garden project where the grass was removed without chemicals. So it was sod cut and sheet mulch. The landscape contractor had never done that before. And so it was a really great learning process for the contractor. But in this particular site, there is no access to irrigation. So there was no existing system, and it had to rely on winter rains. Now, again, giant building, relatively small area, and you can see this is an area that gets a lot of water. You can see the storm drain right in the middle of it. The challenge really was how to plant something and try to make it that it could live on rainwater. So this required our using California native plants, the Mediterranean plants that are adapted, and mulching very, very deep. So 6 inches was the minimum depth of mulching when we planted. And after a year, this is what it looked like. And I think considering it didn't have any water, supplemental water, it's doing pretty well. Continues to flower, and all the debris is supposed to be left on site. So when there is any cutting that happens at all, it's supposed to be chop and drop, which is a good practice in every landscape, but especially in a landscape that doesn't have any irrigation. Okay, I promise you this is the final one. This was also a great project because it was a commercial site, but in a very residential area. So it was a wonderful demonstration of what could be done on a residential site, but using this non-functional turf as an example. And again, the grass was removed without chemicals. There was an interest in having a very naturalistic planting and very naturalistic dry creek bed, and this is what it looked like after, which for a commercial site is a pretty welcoming kind of dry creek bed, and also is easily seen by the neighborhood as something they can do. All right, so that is one organization's approach to removing grass and replacing it with landscaping. Let's talk about, sort of dive into some of the principles of how we can actually have the landscape work for us, the new landscape, by leaning into biodiversity and have that really become the driving factor in how our landscape stays healthy and even more resilient over time. This requires that we begin to, when we think about biodiversity, it requires us to think with something we call ecosystems thinking. So this is a more complex way of thinking about a landscape. Instead of breaking a landscape down into individual components, these plants, this irrigation system, and evaluating each plant maybe for its water use, or each plant or each irrigation component for how efficient it is. Ecosystems thinking says the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So a lot of what goes on in ecosystems thinking is not a disregard of the efficiency of irrigation or the water use requirements of plants, but rather using that as a very basic foundation to get started, but then leaping from that and beginning to think, what would happen if we put all of these things into the system? How do the various elements interact with each other? And how do we take advantage of those interactions? And that the emphasis on ecosystems thinking really is toward this interaction. And you can see this image by the Pacific Institute was really trying to start having us think about the value of replacing non-functional turf with more climate appropriate landscapes. And you can see all the pieces that are going on here are things that we want to think about. And this is what the watershed approach and the principles of regenerative landscaping can start to help us to address. I want to remind you that nature organizes itself into very complex ecosystems, even on a tiny level. This picture is of a 4-inch crack in pavement. So you can see here lots of different things going on, lots of ecosystem services happening. Let's not disregard the power of plants. Ecosystems thinking essentially as I said, requires us to start designing for complexity and thinking about interconnectedness rather than the individual elements of a landscape. So when we start to think in this way, we begin to recognize that landscapes that are healthy are actually maximizing various cycles. And if we identify those particular cycles, we can start to think about how the elements of our landscape are contributing to maximizing these particular cycles. So the 4 cycles that we're going to take a look at today are the solar energy cycle. How does this landscape maximize solar energy collection? And if we think about solar energy collection, there are a lot of ways that we can define that. But the number one thing is plants. they eat sunshine, so they're going to collect a lot of solar energy. But it also can extend to the types of hardscape, the types of materials that we're using. We want to maximize solar energy collection, not solar energy release. We want to also maximize on-site water cycling. How do we make sure that every drop of rain that comes from the sky is held on the site for the benefit of the plants? And then we actually have the plants to be able to put that water back up into the atmosphere for the benefit of the community. How do we maximize the cycling of minerals and nutrients? Turns out that plants don't actually access nutrient out of the soil. They have to have a symbiotic relationship with the microbial community to access minerals and nutrients that are not water soluble. So just to be clear, water soluble nutrient can be added into a landscape, form of fertilizer as an example, and the plant can access that water soluble nutrient, but it needs water to do that. It does not need nearly the same amount of water to maximize nutrient that it gets through its symbiotic relationship with the microbiome. So how do we put all those soil mining enterprises to work for us in our landscape to access the minerals and nutrients that are required by the plants in our system? And then finally, how do we maximize conditions for biodiversity? Not just how do we plant it, but how do we invite it? And again, looking at nature, it's super complex. Like at every level, it's complex and interconnected. If you look at this landscape, these plants self-organized. They are collaborating to maximize solar, water, mineral, and biodiversity cycles. There are several plant groups represented here. They're working in connection with each other, and you know that they had biodiversity because for sure those Bell's daisies were brought by a bird, and they're working together to exploit the conditions on this particular site. And that's really what we want to mimic, because this is resilient design. And we're going to do that. Prairies and grasslands are great examples for us to be able to observe how do they work together in a grassland or a remnant of a prairie. This is a system that is more complex over time, becomes more complex over time, and it's self-organizing. Is super important for us to remember. And the reason that these prairies and grasslands are able to do this kind of landscaping or persist in this kind of landscaping is because there is very high plant family, and plant species diversity. A healthy grassland actually represents a huge diversity of plants. They're called grasslands, and we think, oh, we can mimic that by planting, multiple types of grasses, but actually grasslands and prairies have an enormous variety of plant material in them. And in general, yes, grasses will represent about 50% of this type of landscape, but it also has 4B plants in it. It has brassicas in it. It has legumes in it. It has annuals and perennials in it, even when it's a perennial system. And that's because all of these different plants are able to really start to work together to create this highly complex and resilient system. And there has been an experiment that's gone on in Germany over the last 20 years. It's called the Jenna experiment. And this is an experiment where plots of land were planted with different plant material. And that sounds like something that would be happening at UC Davis or UC Riverside or Irvine, any agricultural school is going to do this kind of thing, planting plots with different species and looking to see, how much water does it require in this plot, and how is it performing. But the thing that the Jenna experiment did that was completely different from these monoculture experiments, basically reductive landscape experiments where, we're breaking things down into the individual plants. The Jenna experiment said, what happens when we combine plants? And so, yes, they planted out monocultures of these plants, but they also started planting in groups. And those groups ranged from 5 different species up to 60 different species. And they observed over the course of this 20 past years what's going on these plots. And the thing that I want to, the thing that came out of this was they learned, I know this is a very confusing slide, so just bear with me a second. The thing that they learned from the Jenna experiment is that it's not just about species diversity. That's important. But even more important is having plants from different families, because the different families bring different biological materials to the ecosystem as a whole. The Jenna experiment found that as plant richness, so that's diversity of families, diversity of species, as that richness increased, there were positive compounding and positive cascading effects that would occur. And an example of that was that the cycling of, just if you pick here phosphorus, or you pick here the nitrogen cycling, these had compounding effects where it increased in the nitrogen cycling, as an example, by having this species richness. And that's not adding nitrogen in, that's processing nitrogen by the system. Then we had other effects that where things got reduced. So things like well, actually you can't see it as much here as you can on this slide. The presence of weeds, the presence of chewing insects and insects that could do damage, the presence of pathogens, this had a cascading effect. In other words, it was a decrease in those things in this ecosystem. The pathogen resistance went up the greater the plant richness. And you can see here that the species diversity is going from 0 to 60 different species in the particular plot. So this is something for us to really think about. And if our objectives, or the objectives of our client, let's say, is to capture and store carbon in a system, really the only way to do that is to have this very broad species richness, because as you can see here, as species richness increased, the carbon storage increased. In other words, the takeaway from the Jenna experiment is more in a landscape. So let's just take a quick moment of science to appreciate this amazing environmental transformations that plants are driving. They create it. First of all, remember that plants are eating sun, and liquid sun is exuded through the roots of the plants to feed the soil microbiome and to attract microbes to the roots of the plants. So photosynthesis from a very high diversity landscape is actually fueling the entire, all the growth, all the processes that are happening in that ecosystem are being powered by the sun through the plant. And also, the plant and the soil are one organism. There's a wonderful study, which we'll hear more about at the upcoming Landscape Summit at Valley Water. There's a wonderful study about how plants are actually consuming microbes in order to get not just the nutrient, but also to have those microbes incorporated into their bodies. And when the microbes are incorporated into their bodies, something happens. And we see the results of this microbial infiltration in the behavior of the plants in the ecosystem. And what I mean by that is, we're used to thinking about plants and landscaping as, hey, let's select plants that have a lower plant factor than the grass. Let's select a 50% of grass plant. It only requires 50% of the water that grass does. And this is the way that we have constructed our view of building landscapes. And it's not just in California, it's really everywhere. And in large part, that came from looking at plants in monoculture and evaluating them in monoculture. So yes, we can select plants that require less water according to this paradigm. That's okay. It's a good way to get started. But if we don't have family diversity, if we don't have species diversity within these selections, we may not get the drought tolerance that we think we're going to get from these plants, because it's the diversity and the density of the entire ecosystem that creates the behavior of drought tolerance. And oh, by the way, pretty much any other genetic expression. So not just drought tolerance, but salt tolerance, cold tolerance, water tolerance, all of that is created by the plants in the ecosystem working with the microbial community. Because as plants consume these microbes from the soil, there's something that starts to happen in the soil and within the plant as well. And this is called quorum sensing. It's another thing we're going to talk about at our upcoming summit. Quorum sensing is when the biology in the soil and within the plants start to act in concert. They sense that there is a sufficient diversity and a sufficient quantity of the right bacteria. This is particularly a bacterial phenomenon, but really all creatures have a part in quorum sensing. But what they will do is, once they realize that there's a high enough density of a particular bacteria, it will actually be taken up by the plant. And when within the plant, it will genetically modify the plant. It will edit the genes of the plant in order to have the expression of the behavior that this particular microbe is responsible for. So the plant has the potential to be drought tolerant, but it will not become drought tolerant in a true way until the quorum of microbes is there and they've all turned on and they have edited the genes of the plant to create that drought tolerant behavior. Now, what is super cool about all of this is not limited to just this particular plant in the ecosystem. Because the plant has taken the biology into it, it will actually then put the biology into its own progeny, into its seeds. And when those seeds are distributed, they are bringing the right group of microbes into the soil. Each seed can introduce as many as 9 billion microbes. And let's not forget, every single seed has different groups of those 9 billion microbes. So seed and very small plants, seedlings, can become an incredibly cost-effective way to introduce this diversity that we seek in the system in order to get the results that we want of drought tolerance and other resilient behavior. So when we have this higher plant biodiversity, we actually are fostering a much more complex soil food web. We're seeing many, many more soil creatures and creatures that interact with the soil in these diverse areas than we do in areas that don't have that biodiversity. And we even are going to see more of, things that for some of us, we think, wow, we need to get rid of them. But honestly, ants, as an example, are amazing civil engineers. Like, why don't we put these little civil engineers to work for us to create pockets for water to go into in soil, to break up hard soils. This is a really important thing for us to identify, is that even things we might consider to be pests are actually an important part of our food web. Fungi, for example, are attracted to these very diverse situations, especially if there's woody debris. They will actually connect plants. They're an incredibly important part of the soil food web, but they can keep insects in balance. So they actually can keep things like ants and termites and so forth in balance. And if we build specific habitat to encourage more animals coming into our landscape, we can have these really amazing compounding and beneficial cascading effects. And what I mean by specific habitat is really, how do we get more insects, more amphibians, more birds, more animals, really, to bring their biology to the party. We can see moths and butterflies at all growth stages, not just the monarch, it's, all kinds of things. And when we start to have this biodiversity, we get the natural predators attracted, and they keep insect populations, populations that could not be beneficial, they keep them in balance. So this whole idea of biodiversity is really about adding, increasing, becoming more complex instead of finding ways to subtract. When we have insects in the landscape, we're going to get birds, and they are in desperate need of the soft body insects, and then also things like seeds and nectar are also incredibly important. And again, instead of thinking about how do we eliminate these wonderful soil engineers that can be attracted to a highly biodiverse site, let's figure out ways to incorporate them into the design, bring them into the design, understand that, when we have pocket gophers and when we have snakes, actually, if we have snakes, it's unlikely that we have pocket gophers in the same landscape. So, but these are all actually contributing to our diversity, but also helping us to achieve our goals, which is more water infiltration and plants that are more resilient, right? Cooling our cities. When you have those little guys, those little rodents and so forth, the birds of prey have incentive to come and patrol the area. And yes, there's always going to be those usual suspects of our urban, suburban, lifestyle, and they're going to be hanging around and participating in this landscape. But this diversity also attracts the very hungry, charismatic megafauna. And I want to draw your attention to two things. First of all, I first saw herons fishing in a playground, or actually in a field that was adjacent to a playground, fishing for gophers. When I lived in the Bay Area. And I was so taken by that. And I realized, yeah, it's a thing. They actually really like to do that. It supplements their diet of other things. And I also wanted to point out that, in the soil food web, when you go all the way up the food web, you'll find that there are creatures there that do surprising things, like chipmunks. Who knew that they were actually carnivores? And if you build some extra shelter and incorporate, even more opportunities to boost this biodiversity, it's a benefit to the garden. So we have all kinds of things here, from bat boxes and owl boxes and bird boxes to the bee blocks in the lower right-hand corner of the image, which are being incorporated into the construction of some buildings as potential homes for solitary bees. And then, of course, we want to integrate human activity as much as possible to maximize that human impact. It's not a great picture because it was taken off the internet, but this is a park that we're going to show more images of in a little bit, where the entire experience was designed to bring people into the landscape for as much physical activity as possible. And then, of course, don't forget our domesticated animals. They're super important too. Okay, now, biodiversity is super important. Okay, how do we work with nature instead of against her? Well, let's first just take a second to take a look at a little turf removal thing and turf removal case study and try to draw some conclusions from it. Now, this is a residential site. But it was the same type of thing. The turf was removed with a sod cutter. No glyphosate was employed. It was sheet mulched, and it was planted according to the parameters of planting, which was 3 plants per 100 square feet. And it's predominantly, some native plant material mixed with other Mediterranean plants. And a couple of things were located from other parts of the landscape, relocated into the landscape. It has a rainwater capture element, but why is the grass back? What is that about? And it's really easy to, jump up and down and say, well, the maintenance didn't stay after the grass. But why did the grass even want to come back? What was that about? Well, what we just saw is an example of a landscape that didn't work with succession. Succession is the evolution of plant communities through time based on the soil microbiome and the development of the soil microbiome. Now, remember, plants and soil microbiome are working together. So it's not one and then the other. It's both working together to build an environment that is hospitable for different types of plants. And over time, what was once a bare site of just rock and, maybe even some exposed dirt could eventually evolve into a highly complex woody ecosystem. And if there's enough water capture on the site or rainfall, it could even become a climax forest of woody trees. And this time element is something that is happening in every single ecosystem. This is how plants colonize the the landscape of Earth. In those basic pioneer stages when things are bare and degraded, we see more perennial herby perennial grasses, little and even more annual grasses, more things that we call weeds now, but I'm going to start calling forbs because they play a really important role. It's mostly an annual system. It becomes slightly mixed with perennials, especially in the grasses as we move through time. This is a bacterial-based landscape. Disturbed landscapes are bacterial-based, meaning they are dominant with bacteria as opposed to dominant with fungi. And over time, the plants and the microbiome work together to make things more complex. And as it becomes more complex, the fungal domination can begin to take hold. We see more perennial grasses. We see more shrubby and woody plants. And then, the ultimate expression of a fungally dominated landscape, as I said, is a climax forest. This symbiotic relationship is ongoing constantly. Disturbance takes us back into a previous succession. So in other words, if you have a landscape and you disturb, and it's a well-established landscape, but then you start to disturb it by, chemical intervention or mechanical intervention, removing plants perhaps, disturbing mulch and so forth, that landscape, or let's say it burns even, that landscape now is set back to a more bacterial landscape. And the plants that are going to pair with it are going to be more of the annuals and more of the grassy types of plants. This is something for us to keep in mind as we are removing grass off of a landscape and trying to get established a woody system. We can work with succession to get to that woody system, but we need to be aware that that's what's going on. In the previous picture, we saw grass here coming back because the conditions for grass were perfect. We had completely destroyed this site, and it really wasn't densely planted with any other plants to change the soil. And the result is that the grass took advantage of that and paired, with the bacteria, and away it went. Over time, it will become more complex, assuming a higher diversity of plants is introduced into this. But if that diversity of plants is not introduced into this, it's nearly impossible to keep this as an ecosystem that doesn't have the grass in it. So this is something for us to really think about in our turf removal strategies. That soil aggregation that's happening in the soil that the microbes have worked so hard to create, that the plants have worked so hard to create, is actually, it's incredibly strong. It's the infrastructure of the ecosystem, but it's also incredibly fragile. When it's disturbed, it very quickly cascades in a negative way back to being more bacterially dominant. Well, actually, that depends on context. You might want grass, in which case going more bacterially dominant is good. But in our case, where we want the woody plants in the landscape, it's a negative cascade for us. The ecosystem reverts to an earlier succession stage when that disturbance occurs. And the plants that are stimulated are the weed bank. The plant cover is going to express itself as grasses, annuals, and forbs or weeds. These guys start to appear as the grass is diminished. You're going to start to see things like Asteraceae because they are an early pioneer species. They're able to live in very degraded situations, and they're there to help. They want to make this landscape better. When we don't disturb the soil, we get what's called a syntropic effect. Syntropic effects are essentially increasing complexity. So the plant and microbe biodiversity becomes more complex when the site's not disturbed. Our soil aggregation becomes greater. When aggregation is better, we get faster infiltration, and we have a higher water holding capacity in the soil. In other words, we have a really good sponge. And when that water holding capacity improves, more complex perennial plants and shrubs are supported. They have the water available to them to do what they want to do. And when we have this more complex perennial system and it's more diverse, the soil microbiology becomes more complex. And this means that it's now cycling more phytonutrients and small kinds of minerals, a wider diversity of minerals out of the soil profile. And this is essentially going to suppress weeds. That nutrient cycling suppresses weeds and it suppresses pests. And then eventually, at some point, when the site's not disturbed and it's been able to go through succession, perennial native plants that are in the seed bank are able to be expressed because they're stimulated. It's not the weed bank that's stimulated anymore. Now it's the native seed bank. So when we are removing turf, or even if we don't, we want to make sure that we are replacing whatever is there with as many different leaf and root structures as we possibly can. Leaf structures, of course, that's all these different solar panels, but root structures are super, super important. Thinking about what's going on at the roots, having both annuals and perennials, tender plants, woody plants, all in mixture, all together. And that's because when we have this diversity of root system, we're creating a giant soil sponge to the depth of the root system. Listen, microbes are interacting with this plant anywhere there's a root. So when you see roots that are several feet deep, and in some cases 10, 15 feet deep, this is creating a greater water storage than we could ever have in a rain barrel or cistern. And the result is that we are able to support in our landscapes a ecosystem that is more representative of what our ideal native plant environment is. And I would propose that we even look at our native plant systems and ask ourselves, are they degrading or are they becoming more complex and more resilient? And, that's a really good question for us, not to be answered at this time, but it's something to think about. So yes, we mimic what's going on in the native landscape and we help it out a little bit more by making sure that our soil is really super healthy and we get there through the diversity of plant material and, with the different leaf and root structures. Now, here's a question. Could all of this plant diversity also in some way influence human succession? I mean, over time, I love this graphic because over time, humans have become more attuned to technology and less attuned to the natural world. And I talked about plant blindness earlier. I talked about biophobia. These are conditions that could not exist in times when plants ruled the world. So maybe there's a way for us to influence that human succession and actually heal this chronic disconnect from nature's benefit. The landscape itself could be something that changes our relationship with technology, changes our relationship, with the outdoors. In a landscape, fractals and fascination are stimulating our brain. This is a boost to creativity and problem solving. And we see it in the landscape, in the different types of plants that we can have there. We see it, in the animals that come in. Textures and movement can stimulate, feelings of calm, and again, this fascination thing. So having plants that have that kind of texture and movement are really beneficial for people who are on their screens all day. And, look, humans just want to have fun in most cases, especially when they're young and they haven't really been trained yet, to be plant blind. They want to get out into this. So maybe we could prioritize a little bit of this wildness, a little bit of this fascination in our landscapes, along with the focus on diversity and of structures. Maybe just the way that we put these all together could be a little bit more natural in and of itself in order to stimulate this good connection of humans to the landscape. And I think that's going to be particularly important in commercial settings. So this leads us to naturalistic planting design. And again, we can consult some really great resources and consider the context in a commercial institutional site. We have a lot of opportunities potentially to experiment and to do really interesting things. There's a wonderful paper on the benefits of these public spaces, these biodiverse public spaces in cities and communities that UN Habitat put out. And I highly recommend, if you're interested in the fundamentals of naturalistic planting, this book by Benjamin Vogt on prairie planting. It's mostly residential in focus, but the principles are the same. So maybe commercial properties can lead, and maybe wild isn't the right word to use. Maybe it's more like untamed. And commercial properties perhaps could be the ones that lead the landscape revolution toward more untamed landscapes. And that's because they have greater resources and they have other reasons for investing as well, which we'll see in a second. Here's an example of a global headquarters where untamed meadowscape was embraced as part of the sustainability goals of the entire organization. It was explicitly stated that they wanted to have a landscape that was as pollinator friendly and ecosystem diverse as possible. They wanted to eliminate and reduce and eliminate the use of fossil fuels and fertilizers, pesticides, and reduce their water use. They specifically went after this different look in order to have something that was recognizable as being different from the status quo. They wanted to invite wildlife. They wanted biodiversity. It aligned with their corporate commitment to sustainability. And this was something that their shareholders were demanding as well. So and the maintenance of the site is that it's allowed to grow wild. It's allowed to attract all these things. It offers changes throughout the seasons, and that's what they were going for. And I think it's very interesting to look at how it's actually implemented in the situation. I mean, of course, you see a deer there, but what's going on here is the untamed landscape is allowed to do its thing, but adjacent to it is something that's tamed, so that well, first of all, there are maintenance benefits to having what we call cues to care. A cue to care, CUE, to care, is essentially giving humans the message that this is an intentional landscape. It's untamed intentionally. We could perfectly well tame it, but we're not going to. We are allowing it to be this way. So that's what all this little bit of mowing on the edge is indicating. But it also has a maintenance benefit in that, you can get the valve boxes and you can get to utilities and things like that very easily. In Copenhagen, there is something quite amazing going on. The landscape architecture firm of SLA has been designing, and actually not just in Copenhagen, they're a global developer, landscape architecture, developer builder. And they do projects all over the world, which essentially look like this, no matter where they are. The context is different with the plant material that's used, but the look is the same. And what's happening here is a landscape, a commercial landscape that is inviting people into the landscape. And the most important thing that I want to draw your attention to is what's happening right in the middle of this landscape, where it's an obvious depression that is paved over with this permeable paving. Obvious depression. In the dry time, this is called a social swale. It's a place for people to gather. But when it rains, it fills up with rainwater. And so the swales have a dual use. They are used both for social interaction and they're used to capture the rainwater. And in this particular case, it's capturing up to 3,000 square meters of rain in these social basins. The result is that rainwater is now being viewed by the community not as a threat, but as a resource that can be celebrated, that can be collected, that is an integral part to the overall health of the community. And they're very forward thinking in the way that they're designing things. Their plantings are absolutely untamed. The building materials are natural building materials. I mentioned the social swales concept. It is in all, even here we have a social swale. Children are invited to be in the environment even after a rainstorm. And in large part because rainwater is being filtered by this massive landscape. Everything is designed to encourage a physical activity and interaction with the landscape. It enhances community engagement and beauty, and it does all these other benefits that we're always talking about, like reducing air pollution, improving the quality of life, cooling the city, and biodiversity and pollinator habitat. All the things that we talk about as being important are incorporated into these designs, and they are truly ecologically sustainable by all members of the community, all life in the community, from the microbes, up to the skies with the birds. In San Francisco, there is a botanic garden. The San Francisco Botanic Garden has been experimenting with natural lawn for more than 20 years. About 20 years ago, they decided that since they were taking children out onto the lawn to explore the different kinds of little plants that were growing in the lawn, and they were using it as an educational center, and that the community was engaged with this lawn, they decided that they were going to eliminate the inputs of fertilizers. They were going to mow it on a much more infrequent schedule. They were going to water it a lot less, and they were going to really invite the community to come in. And that, just doing that, even in a lawn area, and I know that's not the topic for today, but it's an indicator to us that this inviting of more biodiversity into the landscape and designing it so that people can be in it is really a key component of where we're going in urban and commercial landscapes. And then we have the work of Nigel Dunnett, again, a worldwide landscape designer. I think not even a landscape architect, but a landscape designer who is really the father of urban naturalistic planting, and uses exclusively plugs, very small plants, and a lot of seed in order to create these super complex ecosystems that have just incredible color, form, biodiversity. It's all happening, in these landscapes, and it happens all year round. One of the most famous designs that was done was the Olympic Park. I certainly hope that in Southern California there is some of this that's going to happen in our upcoming Olympics. Nigel actually designed the Tower of London Super Bloom, where the moat of the Tower of London, which used to be all grass, was converted into this more meadow area and also turned into a place that people could explore. This was inspired by his visit to California and his experience of a super bloom that happened in Southern California. And he took that idea back to London and said, okay, how can we actually now develop an ecosystem that is going to replicate that super bloom and have, things that happen kind of all year round? And in very, very early May, this is what it looks like. It's still super complex. You can see now, how people can interact with the site, which you can't really see with all the flowers going off. So you can see the structure here. But this is incredibly popular. It's a huge benefit to the community. The Barbican Mediterranean garden that he designed is really a wonder. You can see also step garden. And I think the important thing here to understand is it doesn't matter that the plant material is from the Mediterranean or the plant material is from a steppe climate, which is far drier than what a traditional London, certainly, environment is. It doesn't matter. These plants, when they're paired together, they create their own ecosystem. They figure it out. They work with the resources that are coming naturally from the sky. And these are largely unirrigated landscapes, or minimal irrigation of landscapes. I think this quote from the vice chairman of CBRE, a global real estate organization, is really wonderful. Paul Amrich says, there's not a developer or forward-thinking building owner today that doesn't have outdoor space top of mind. The time is now for us to be really pushing for more strategic investment in turf replacement projects and more commercial landscape projects. The Pacific Institute came out and said, hey, look, this non-functional turf irrigation ban, hey, it's not a problem. It's actually a huge business opportunity for us to shift to sustainability, to shift to regeneration in our urban areas. And there are two great reports that I want to recommend you take a look at if you're working in this space, talking specifically about the economic benefit that results from having commercial landscapes that are emphasizing what they call here green infrastructure, but it's basically what we've been talking about, the watershed approach, making, the regenerative tactics, and looking at the cycles that happen in an ecosystem thinking approach to landscaping. It has been shown unequivocally, it's a big word, that great landscape actually differentiates corporations and property owners in a very competitive real estate and workforce market. This outdoor emphasis is a logical next step in the evolution of flexible offices. If we're asking people to come from their homes where they have control of their environment, and we're asking them to come into an office setting, we have to provide them with this opportunity to connect with nature. And what we find is that these design landscapes, they are emphasizing keeping people connected. So Wi-Fi is really good in these landscapes. There are lots of electrical outlets to plug into. There's strategic placement of trees and shade coverings so that people can work on a phone or a laptop, so they can have the screen, but they can also be in this natural setting. And also that there are ways for people to gather and interact within the landscape. So it's not a solitary experience. There are places for them to commune. If we wanted to make investment in removing grass and creating new kinds of landscapes in urban areas, there's probably no better way and no more cost-effective way than the Miyawaki Forest Pocket Parks. There are actually several of these pocket parks in the Berkeley area that you can go to see. This particular organization, the Dehaney Park, or the Miyawaki Forest Pocket Park, it's an approach, but it's implemented by various organizations. And this particular one was actually converting a landfill in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I stumbled across it the first time from a social media post. I was really fascinated by this picture because what they were showing was that this little forest, and a Miyawaki Forest Pocket Park, is a very small, densely planted, and really not maintained in the conventional way. It's allowed to become more complex. Area planted with a huge diversity of trees. And so these little pocket parks have an incredible effect on the surrounding community. And one of them is this heat island effect. Look at the difference. It's half the temperature in the pocket park as it is on the bare soil next to it. And there have been many studies done recently, one in a scientific journal called The Innovation, that shows that rain gardens can reduce the surface temperature by 4.5 degrees centigrade. The street trees themselves, especially when densely planted, could probably do even more. But if not densely planted and just planted as street trees, this is almost 4 degrees centigrade. Parks in general are 3 degrees centigrade, and playgrounds around the same. So really having lots and lots of these smaller interventions could be an economical way. And I think that for our non-functional turf areas, these are great things for us to think about to introduce into some of these landscapes. Why not plant lots more trees and really dense shrub planting and lots of ground cover and so forth. So something to think about. Pocket parks, Miyawaki Forest Pocket Parks. Another great potential intervention is the pollinator corridors. If we've got lots of these narrow spaces, why don't, and for the most part, they're not being interacted with by humans. They aren't places where people are parking. They aren't places where people have to get out of their cars and we have to worry about it. I mean, those are non-functional turf areas, but in commercial settings, they're mostly ornamental areas that are, directing traffic. People aren't at all interacting with them. What an amazing opportunity to turn them into pollinator corridors. Densely biodiverse, dense planting of plants to attract the pollinators and potentially even other insects and animals that we would like to see. And you can find out more if you just search pollinator corridors. This particular one is from Australia, but it's a movement that's happening around the world. We could make quick lawn transformations and really completely alter the grass areas by planting into them, or if we remove the grass, then planting just as densely with some other aggressive perennial plant material. So yarrow lawns, planting bulbs directly into lawn, planting gazanias over lawn, and even caropia can be planted over the grass. And it actually performs almost better when the grass is left in place. So here's an example of caropia plugged into an existing lawn. The caropia is more of a nitrogen fixing plant, and the grass is more of a carbon fixing plant. And together, the two of them, share resources, and everything is green. Uses a lot less water. In fact, once it gets established like this, the irrigation is de minimis. I mean, really almost no irrigation, except in very, 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 very dry times. And if it doesn't have any shade cover. But if there's any shade cover at all, like in a median or some place where there might be trees, this is a great way to convert things. One thing that we can do even before we apply for a turf removal rebate, is we can think about not eliminating forbs anymore from our landscapes. So in other words, identifying the forbs that are growing on a landscape or that's come up on a landscape, and then asking ourselves, what more does this landscape need in order to take advantage of this great work that the forb is doing? So a great example of that I showed you before were the Asteraceae, basically dandelions. Dandelions break up compaction. If you're removing turf, dandelions are something that you want to have because they're going to break the compaction underneath that turf layer. Plantain is another thing that we see all the time with people obsessing about removing it from commercial landscapes, when plantain is one of the most nutritious insect feeding plants there is, and it brings copper up to the ecosystem, which is an essential element for growth and development. And there are a lot of other things that are happening in the forb world. And you notice I'm calling them forbs instead of weeds. I'm trying to make that change. But this is just something that we can do to make a transformation even before we remove the grass, or just after we remove the grass. Let those weeds do their thing, forbs do their thing, and take advantage, like plant into it. Really start to identify things that are good for our soil. And if they show up in our gardens, don't rush to eliminate them. They're doing something interesting. They're doing something important. And we can actually add more perennial forbs into a landscape. Sometimes this is best done with very small plugs, but it can also be done with seed. So we remove the grass, we have planted some structural shrubs, but now we take a look at what's happening in between that. We let the weeds, forbs that come up, do their thing, and we add into it even more forbs, the phacelias, the penstemons, even the black-eyed Susans, all these kinds of things add biodiversity. Yarrow is a great biodiversity booster. The cranesbills, wonderful biodiversity boosters. And at the very least, even putting some clover. And there are many types of clover. You could use 5, 6 different kinds. Now, I know, I hear you in your heads going, what is this person talking about letting weeds be in the landscape? What is she talking about allowing clover? It's not even a native plant to be in our landscape. Here's the thing. What we're doing is we're working with succession. Don't worry, these plants do not persist when the conditions arise for the native plants. So once the soil is fixed, the native plants are going to easily outcompete this stuff because they're waiting for the soil to be in a condition that they can actually exploit. So just think about complex ecosystems, even in lawn. Existing stormwater basins are a great opportunity for landscape transformation, whether the grass is kept in place or it's removed. These are places that often have grass ground cover, spray irrigation, are covered with, have trees planted into them, always struggling because of the grass. This is an opportunity for us. We could actually rethink our stormwater basins as being super biodiverse. Like this one, again, a Nigel Dunnett project, highly biodiverse storm basin. I mean, can we envision wildness like this or untamed areas like this in every single urban center? I can. So we're going to take some questions. We have about 15 minutes, and this particular guide is going to be coming to you in an email that's going to be delivered to the email address that you used to register for the webinar, and a bunch of other resources. I referenced several studies, several guides. They're all available to you, and we can include that in email to you. So we'd love to get your feedback. Hopefully, we are going to put up a poll to get some feedback. And were there any questions?
What an amazing presentation. Oh my goodness. I always learn so much when you bring your next version of these presentations. So before I start, and we have a hard out at 11:30.
Yep.
Pamela mentioned the Landscape Summit that is coming up February 27th. So I've put the link in the chat box. I know some of you have already registered, especially if you're in the Santa Clara County area. It is being offered live. If you are not, it's also it will be Zoomed, so you can attend virtually. And what she was talking about, she said, is really an orientation to what we will be talking about in more detail with some amazing speakers just a few weeks away. So make sure you register for that. So there were definitely questions, and the questions came before you started going into the details. Yeah. So
it always happens.
it is. So the question is, when those questions were asked, did they feel like you actually responded in a way that made sense? I'm going to go ahead and share what some of them were. And then, of course, questions come in at the, oh, here's some new ones coming in. All right, here we go.
There's a new one, and that is maybe a conversation for all of us. And it is there any success in pressuring local governments to update laws around landscape on the community level? Or at least enforcing California state law. And I'm assuming that this is has to do potentially with homeowners associations, with the California state law that says, it is not legal to waste water. And that's often in conflict with the type of design that we are talking about here, naturalistic planting. And in large part, that's because it's not been the way that most landscapes look. And so it can feel very, very radical. There are actually a lot of case studies all around the country. I wasn't able to really find that many in California, but there are many case studies in places where there's even more, potentially more diligent enforcement of community codes around landscapes. And there has been a great deal of success on the part of property owners in pushing back against what is really outdated aesthetic and an outdated ideal of what landscapes should be. So I recommend that you do a search and a web search, and I would put in homeowners associations pushing back on landscape or something like that, and a bunch of these situations will come up. In several cases, one in particular in Maryland, and in places like Wisconsin, really kind of like, I would say, aesthetically conservative environments. Maryland, Wisconsin laws were changed to specifically incorporate untamed types of landscapes, biodiverse landscapes, as an ideal. Yes. So there was a note here about Phoenix, Arizona, passing an ordinance to require only native plants, and that is definitely that's definitely great. It's a great ordinance. I think one of the things that I've observed in Phoenix is that there's not sufficient tree planting going on. So when the education around desert landscapes is done, it's a lot of solitary plants, and they don't follow these principles of high biodiversity. And as a result, they are further desertifying. They're actually making it hotter in Phoenix by doing, yes, it's native plants, but it's not an emphasis on this layering and, finding the species richness. And especially around trees, there just isn't enough tree planting. Let's see. Look at all these things. It's gonna, okay.
Yeah.
Was there something else in particular?
Yeah, let me look back. So there were, again, I think one of the questions that you addressed, I mean, the whole last piece of it, but I think maybe in terms of when, as designers or even installers, we're taught that we're supposed to design plants for maturity. So how does that potentially work? How do we start to get this diversity? I mean, the easy way is you don't all plant the same plant, but this idea that there's different canopies and different layers, as far as designing it, if there's anything that you wanted to sort of expand on, just suggestions, directions people can start to go.
Yes. I think this is really an emphasis on looking at succession. So when a landscape is designed and you are imagining maturity, that's all fine, especially for woody plants, right? So woody plants and, ground covers, but especially for woody plants, okay, that becomes like the backbone of the landscape, and they're installed early and hopefully small so that they can actually integrate into the ecosystem and become, part of the ecosystem really early. But the space between is what we're really thinking about, because succession is telling us that the space between is going to be colonized by forbs, whether you like it or not. And you can either battle that or you can embrace it. And if you embrace it, then you can begin to think, well, what kinds of annual plants might need to be here, or ground covers might need to be here, and they're not going to last forever. They're going to be ephemeral. They may only be there for 2 years or 3 years. What kind of tender perennials would we like here? They're not going to last forever, but that's okay. They are bringing their biodiversity into the system while the system matures. So I didn't say it was going to be easy. It's not easy. This is highly complex. It looks like, I think as designers, we often discount these systems because they look so natural. And I will tell you very quickly, about 10 years ago, I designed a residential landscape that was submitted for a magazine. And it was a naturalistic planting, a very, it was a estate garden, giant garden, and it was naturalistic planting. And the magazine was based in New York. And the editor, called me up and said, "Don't you have anything that looks designed?" And I'm thinking, I spent a year in design on that thing. But it wasn't understood. I think now that the aesthetic is catching up, and it may even be driven by property owners, commercial property owners, we don't ordinarily expect to drive such a trend. I think that now that the aesthetic is kind of catching up, if such a landscape were submitted again, it would not be rejected for being too undesigned.
Yeah, I wanted to take just a moment. I didn't know if Ashley or Nick, if there was anything that you wanted to share before we call it a morning.
I was gonna say, I was looking for the bill number, but there is I know that SB 676 was an update to a bill, but there are restrictions in place that don't allow things like a homeowners association to prohibit a home from removing their lawn and putting in a low water use landscape. So this is kind of in response to a previous question about updating laws or enforcing them. So if you are within a homeowners association and they say, hey, you have to have lawn in your front yard and you are not allowed to transform it to a low water use landscape, there's actually at the state level, you legally are allowed to remove a lawn and replace it with low water use plants, even if you're a HOA and your HOA can't make you keep your lawn in place. So that is one thing that we can kind of point to if you are in an HOA and you get pushback on, wanting to remove your front yard lawn. That's just kind of something that's in there. And I know SB 676 was the update. The original said that they couldn't restrict you from putting in artificial turf, but that was removed. So you actually can be restricted from putting in artificial turf now.
Great.
So yes,
Yay.
I
Yay,
think we are,
California.
yeah, really, exactly. I think that's about it for now. We thank you so much for joining us, both those who are here live and those who will be watching the recording.